Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon and to introduce to you Lynda Ozan from the Oklahoma Historical Society, where she is the Deputy Registrar for National Register.
Not even close, but that's all right.
Why don't you tell them?
I'm the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for the state of Oklahoma.
What she said. Lynda has the distinction of being the first graduate from our program in historic preservation, as it was in the 90s before we transitioned into applied history, and has had a very notable career. She served for several years in the Dakotas, South Dakota?
Yes.
South Dakota, and then moved to Oklahoma, where she's been in residence since. She's here today to talk with us about cultural resource management and careers in applied history or historic preservation. So with that said, I'm going to let her take over.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone today about cultural resources. So at its base, cultural resource management really stems from the concept of managing historic assets. So those historic assets could be paintings, they could be archaeological sites, they could be historic buildings. There's a wide variety of what historic assets really mean. And in the field of cultural resource management, those positions vary according to that, what we're trying to preserve or what we're trying to protect. And recently, I think what this really stems from is recently I served as a peer reviewer for a national study that was being conducted by two gentlemen on the future of cultural resource management jobs and workforce opportunities. And what they really determined is that while programs, universities are graduating between, maybe 400 to 500, maybe anthropology students or history students in the PhD level, what we're seeing is a really lack of people coming out of those programs with the skill sets to be able to work in cultural resource management. Now, traditionally, when you go to college and you're getting your master's degree or your PhD, you're thinking about probably becoming a professor. But in this day and age, when universities are cutting way back on their programs, many preservation programs across the country are actually being completely cut from the curriculum. Professors' positions just don't exist. Or when they do, you're watching for obituaries to come out so to apply for those jobs, right? And so where the hole is starting to occur is in this avenue of cultural resource management. And I think it gets this misnomer of people who work in our field don't really do history. And I would argue that that's not true, because every day my degrees in history and historic preservation work for me. I am someone who is writing historic documents that will be used for the next 50 to 100 years. I'm looking at historic sites and doing evaluations of them that most people will never get to see, never get to experience firsthand. And so the avenue of going into cultural resource management actually gives you a practical hands-on feel for what history really is. And I think what we learned from this study, beyond the fact that we're not getting people into the programs, is really what schools need to be doing to get students actual practical experience to be able to be hired into cultural resource management. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the terminology, and I don't expect a lot of you to be familiar with it, state historic preservation offices are required because of federal law. In 1966, they passed an act that stated that every state and every territory would have a historic preservation office. And our jobs are very specific. They're outlined to keep the National Register of Historic Places, to review all federally funded, licensed, and permitted projects across the country that could damage historic resources, to work with people to use historic tax credits to rehab historic buildings. And then eventually they added a program called our Certified Local Government, whereby we give money to cities to do preservation-related projects. So our staff is very focused on historic preservation and the management of cultural resources. Each staff member has a specialty. I have a PhD student, recent graduate from Oklahoma University, or the University of Oklahoma, who came to us from the private sector. I have an architect on staff who came to us from the private sector. I have a historic archaeologist who works for us, as well as people, my certified local government coordinator comes to us with a degree, 2 degrees in theater. So there's a variety of backgrounds that people can have to come work for us, but it's that practical experience that gets their foot in the door. And so how do we get those people in our office who have practical experience? And it comes back to the curriculum. What are they being taught at their bachelor's level, at their master's level, whatever level they're gaining their degree in? What is that experience and how can it translate into a real job? So what we're looking for are things like internship opportunities at the college level, certainly curriculum changes to focus on cultural resource management, and then the encouragement of underrepresented communities to participate in these programs. And by underrepresented, I mean, it typically people understand what that means, but we're looking for people, Asian, African-American, the Native populations, LGBTQ. We're looking for the historically Black colleges and universities to start teaching curriculums that talk about preservation, or the tribal universities to start teaching those kind of curriculums so that those diverse communities can become part of the employment opportunities to bring them into our offices and help us expand our programming areas. But it's not just about what the state historic preservation offices need, because federal agencies have to comply with specific federal laws, which in this case means before they can do an action, they have to evaluate whether there's an archaeological site in the path of their project, whether there's historic buildings in the path of their projects, and they need people from the outside community, outside of the SHPO world, to be able to do those projects. And that's where the private sector comes into play. So if we're not producing students at the college level with those types of experiences, we're creating this huge gap in opportunities for being able to hire people. And that really becomes an issue with the current passage of the infrastructure bill, which will be great for every state, right? It's a huge influx of money into the economies of those states. But part of that requirement is that in order to build a new bridge, in order to put in new telecommunications towers, in order to put in fiber optics, you have to have somebody like me come out and tell you if you're going to impact a historic archaeological site or if you're going to impact a historic building. And you can't do that if these people in college never get that training. And so really what the study that we, in terms of the evaluation, is we're seeing a failure in our curriculum in our universities to teach students so that they can get these jobs. When we look ahead, we're looking at a period of tremendous opportunities and growth in our field because of these funding opportunities. The transportation funding bill runs for 5 years. And so for the next 5 years, there's going to be all of these projects that are coming on board where we're going to need people who have specialties in history, in anthropology, in archaeology, to be able to evaluate our cultural settings and determine what kind of impact these historic resources have. And I can tell you, without my internship experiences in my undergrad, I don't think I would have been able to get my foot in the door. As when I was earning my bachelor's degree, I worked in Washington, D.C. when I worked for the Park Service. And so I spent an entire semester in Washington, D.C. working for the Park Service while also meeting with federal agencies and learning what they do. In graduate school, while I was at Youngstown State, I worked for a program in Pennsylvania where we went out and surveyed areas where, yes, back in 1997, they still had outhouses. And so they were finally putting in sanitary sewer systems for these people in their homes. And we were going out and evaluating where these pipelines were going to go so that we weren't impacting archaeological sites or historic buildings. And so without those two internship opportunities, I honestly don't think I would have been able to get the positions that I did. And while Martha briefly touched, or I'm sorry, Dr. Pelini, briefly touched on the types of work that I've done, they're very diverse. I started initially with an oil and gas company that constructs roads. So they did the Virginia Turnpike. And I surveyed all of the areas, not all the areas of the West Virginia Turnpike, but when they expanded the West Virginia Turnpike, I was doing that architectural survey to determine where they could put the road. From there, I went to South Dakota and I worked for the State Historic Preservation Office as a National Register coordinator. And then I came back to Philadelphia, where I worked again in private sector, looking at road construction projects. I spent time in North Carolina working as a city planner, looking at how local government controls development and how that development impacts the culture there and how we work to save historic buildings within that cultural development. And then eventually made my way to Oklahoma, where I married someone from here, and I'm never ever going to get to leave. Trying not to hold that against him. But anyway, so we're looking for people who have those kind of diverse backgrounds to fill these positions. But if you don't have those opportunities to get internships, that's part of the problem. And I've listened to this session all day today, right? I kept it going in the background while I was working so that I could understand what students were doing as projects and what was going on campus. And AmeriCorps jobs are a great opportunity. A lot of the AmeriCorps jobs actually serve as internships for these types of positions. When I was doing the project in Pennsylvania, half the people I worked with worked for AmeriCorps. And so there are those types of things that can get you that experience that can then get your foot in the door for CRM jobs. We also, I want to emphasize, because I think when you go to college, you have this ideal of, you want to be a historian, you want to serve the greater good and do this amazing research, and everybody will read your book, or everybody will know who you are because of some fabulous paper you've written. In this field, people think that that's not the case, but you have the opportunity to preserve and protect a cultural history by doing CRM work that most people will never experience. In Oklahoma, just this year, we've got a consultant who's surveying, and I know it sounds politically incorrect, but in Oklahoma, this is the actual term. We have what are called all Black towns, and these are towns that are settled by former slaves. And so there's about 13 of these communities that they're going to go out and do architectural surveys on, speak to the community members to collect histories, and get a good understanding of how these towns developed, how we can protect and save them, but also write a historic context about them so that people in the future will understand why these towns existed and how we maintain them through time. Additionally, we've done a lot of work with urban renewal, and I can certainly think back to my time in Youngstown and know that urban renewal had a huge impact on the development of downtown Youngstown and the surrounding neighborhoods. But in Oklahoma, we're looking specifically at, say, Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and the impact that it had to hundreds, thousands of houses, downtown commercial buildings that were destroyed, and what was built back in its place, and have a greater understanding of the impact that we had on the economically diverse communities that we were destroying. We also, like I mentioned earlier, have access to places that most people will never get to see in their lifetime. I've been back to the Speakeasy on Fort Sills Base in Oklahoma, and no one gets to see the Speakeasy. They don't even know that it still exists, or that Fort Sill had an amusement park on the backside of base, but they were only available to officers. So you get to see things like that, or you get to go experience rock art in its original location and do interpretations and understanding of what that rock art meant to specific tribal people and work with those tribes. Probably about 7 summers ago, I think we figured out, I spent a week with the Cherokee Nation looking for their Trail of Tears locations in Oklahoma. Oklahoma was their final destination on the Trail of Tears. This is where everyone was coming to, forcibly removed to Oklahoma. And so I spent all that time with the tribes looking for specific locations, and we found bits of the road in which they walked on and came to Oklahoma. And you want to talk about having an amazing cultural experience, historical cultural experience, is get out there with the Cherokee Nation and have them tell you the stories that have been passed down to them through generations of what the Trail of Tears meant to them as a culture. And so again, you think about cultural resources and we talk about it in terms of experiences and what you learn in college, how does that translate into what you do every day? For me, I use my history degrees every single day. And it's a perk, right? I mean, a lot of people get degrees and never get to work in their field. I've had some pretty amazing experiences, and so is my staff. I mean, we're talking about recently I hired our architectural historian and our historic archaeologist, and both of them came from private sector where they one worked for ODOT, Oklahoma Department of Transportation, helping them build roads and helping them to explain why it was okay to destroy archaeological sites. And now she's on the flip side and is so excited to be able to protect them. I had my architectural historian come to us from the private sector where he worked with rehab projects. So he worked for an architect and he found the history and the historic photographs and historic drawings that would allow them to do rehab to these historic buildings and get tax credits. Our architect came to us from that same type of background. And so there are plenty of opportunities in the cultural resource management field that most people don't consider a history degree to fit into, but it fits into quite nicely. And then we also have things like, as I mentioned, I have a theater major. She's got a master's in theater. She is amazing at community outreach because she was so used to, performing on stage. And so that's really what community outreach is about. And so she does an amazing job of engaging with the communities and working with them on preservation related issues. We currently have a position vacant for an architectural survey coordinator. I've had it posted 3 times and I can't get anyone that meets qualifications because they're not learning how to do it in college. And so the big gap that we see from our end of things, and not just from the State Historic Preservation Office, but I've had conversations with ODOT. I've had conversations with Fish and Wildlife. I've had these conversations with many federal agencies, and we can't get students to apply for these entry-level positions that actually meet the needs that we have because they're not getting that education in college. And so again, our big disconnect is, what are universities teaching? What are they not teaching? And how can we get the two to meet so that these large gaps that we have out there as job opportunities can finally be filled? And that's really what we're looking for. And I'm hoping that by working with universities, we can find that connection and make that happen. And what's sad is that so many of the universities are cutting their historic preservation programs or reducing them in such a way that the students aren't getting that practical experience. Other things, I mean, I can talk all day about the types of jobs that we have available and the types of projects that we do, but the meaningful impact that we have really at the end of the day is collecting that cultural history that can be transposed and passed down through generations. I had the opportunity to work with the community of Tulsa on the Tulsa Race Massacre. Never did I think a degree that I received in Ohio could really be applicable out in the Midwest. And that's really, Oklahoma's kind of a no man's land. We're not the Midwest, we're not the South, we're not the West. We just are. So all the things that happen in these other areas actually happen here too. So we have plantations, we have slaveholders here. We had obviously tribes relocated here. We have racial issues here, just like everyone else. But being able to participate in them and collect those histories and be able to share them makes our job more meaningful to us. And so, again, I keep coming back to, what do we teach students in college to get them into these careers that aren't professors or aren't high school history teachers, right? I mean, that's when you tell someone you're getting a degree in history, they're like, oh, so you're going to be a teacher. And Dr. Polana can tell you my answer was always no. I don't want to be a teacher ever. And this was my way of finding my passion for doing history and translating it into the real world in a real marketable job. And they are out there and they pay quite well. especially if you're in the private sector. So I think at the end of the day, what I'm hoping is that the students can learn that these jobs do translate, your degrees do translate into jobs that pay well, jobs that my daughter is excited are 8 to 5 jobs Monday through Friday, and she can have her weekends off, rather than the teaching position she was thinking about going into. So they do translate into real world endeavors that can make you money and that can give you fulfillment in your passion for history. Martha, what kind of questions do the students have?
Anna, okay, what, Mitchell?
Are there certain places, specific places to look for jobs?
How do you find them?
How do you find jobs? Okay, that's a good question. As I mentioned, every state and territory is required to have a state historic preservation office, and every state has job postings. So part of it is finding or deciding where you want to move, right? If that's your goal, where do you want to move? Look for jobs that way. Also, the National Trust post jobs, the National Council for State Historic Preservation offices post jobs, trade magazines post jobs, and a lot of them, I mean, I have children that are the age of you all in the room, right? And so they're always telling me the way you look for jobs is so different than the way you did back then, which is true, obviously, and the way you apply for them is different. But I post jobs all the time, and trade magazines have online subscriptions where you can post jobs to. And so you just have to look for those types of jobs. If you want to work in the private sector, you figure out who the big companies are. Out here, it's Devon, it's Chesapeake, it's all the oil and gas people. That's what Oklahoma does. We drill, baby, drill. And that's how we make our money. But you look for those big companies, and all of them have to have cultural resource teams. And so you get your foot in the door that way. And you learn if you can work for the private sector or if you can't, which was my case. I didn't like the idea of tearing down buildings or blowing through archaeology sites. So I wanted to work for the flip side of it, for the people that want to save them and protect them. And so it just depends on which way you want to go and where you look for those jobs.
Does that answer the question?
No.
Okay, so I've got one for you, and it's from the other side. We're in the process of trying to revise our curriculum.
Mhm.
And if you could suggest, say, in addition to an internship or multiple internships, what, say, 3 courses would be most beneficial if you saw them on a resume?
Okay. The first is going to be an intro to historic preservation, because an intro to historic preservation teaches you preservation law. It teaches you basic components of preservation, such as what a state historic preservation office is, how local government perceives historic preservation, and then, how state levels also see it. That's the big one. You've got to have that. Architectural history is another one that's really integral to all of it, depending on which position you're applying for. But architectural history gets you a long way. Because let's face it, I have 2 degrees in history, right? And a certificate in historic preservation. But I can sit and do archaeology all day long because in my undergrad, I had a minor in archaeology. So I can do both. And then the third one would probably be, I'm trying to think, probably, boy, that's tough. There's a lot of good courses. But it's probably one on public administration, because being able to understand how government works and policies and how laws are written and things like that are really important in what we do too, from both ends, whether you're in private sector or working for the government.
Okay. Lynda, we have a question from YouTube. Jessica wants to know, do most people you work with hold masters or higher degrees, or does experience matter more on applications?
Experience matters more. Our degrees, I often say our degrees are terminal at the master's level, because typically if you're going for a PhD in historic preservation, it's because you want to teach historic preservation. So there's no real sense in going forward in that expense and that commitment in time to get that PhD, because you don't really need it to do this job. I have a master's degree and it propelled me into the position I'm in now. So if you want to move up through the ranks, you get that master's degree. But you can come in with a bachelor's degree and get practical experience and move up through the ranks. So.
How would you suggest students look for internships?
Ooh, that's tough. Okay, it's not really all that tough. I ran an internship program in South Dakota. So South Dakota offers between 3 to 5 internships every year, and they're flexible based on semesters. So you can either work there during the summer, fall, or spring semesters. But many states have those internship programs. The National Park Service has internship programs. When I got my internship in Washington, D.C., I had been accepted for four other internships in Washington, D.C. through the Park Service, as well as the architect for the Capitol. So there are lots of internship opportunities if you're willing to travel. And that was the other thing I wanted to mention. If you want a job in preservation, take the job, no matter where it is. I've lived all over the country, and that's some of the best experiences I'll ever have. But take the job, because it gets you the experience you need. No one wanted to live in South Dakota. I didn't want to live in South Dakota. I was there for 5 years. It's a long time. But I got the experience, and it propelled me into a career now where I'm the deputy SHPO. I run an entire SHPO. The only person above me is the state historic preservation officer, who's appointed by the governor and doesn't really do much, right? I mean, he's a governor appointment, and he runs the Oklahoma Historical Society. That's his main job. So he basically stays out of our way, and our staff runs the state historic preservation office. But again, those preservation internships, they're out there. Look at the states, look at the Park Service, look at, with the Park Service, it's not just like in Washington, D.C., which is where I just happen to have mine, but they have them at all their field sites. They have them at all their parks within the states. So it just depends on what avenue you want to take. Like if you want to become ultimately a park ranger, that type of preservation activity, you can do that. They also have them through other federal agencies, like the Forest Service has them, Bureau of Land Management has them, and all of our tribal organizations in Oklahoma have internship opportunities. So there's different levels of government where you can get those internships as well.
Anything else back there?
Well, we're right at the kind of the end of our half an hour, so I guess all that remains is just to thank you, Lynda. I really enjoyed listening to that. I think our students will really benefit from that as well. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.